Hello, today we're observing the sixth Sunday after Pentecost, and the Gospel today tells the story that you may remember as a very wide-known story, the story you're familiar with, the story, what we call the parable of the sower. And Jesus tells the story of a man going out to sow seed. And he tosses the seed on the ground, and some of the seed falls on shallow ground like a pathway where the birds pick it up. A second set of some other seeds fall on rocky ground where it doesn't have a chance to grow roots, so it doesn't last. The third, some other seeds fall among thorns, and the thorns choke it. It's choked the seeds so that they can't grow. And then the fourth batch of seeds falls on fertile ground, and these grow, as he says, 100-fold, some 60, some 30. Anyone with ears listen, he says. What's wonderful about this parable is that at different times in our lives and in different circumstances, we can place ourselves at different places in this story. Sometimes we're the sower, who have promised to plant the seeds of God's teachings. Sometimes we think of ourselves as the ground upon which the seed has fallen, and sometimes we think of ourselves as the seed that has cast on the ground. Wherever we are in our lives as individuals and as a community, we hear something a little bit different in this parable. So let me just think about out loud with you about the difference. To what extent this year do you feel that you're the sower? To what extent this year do you feel like it's what he says about the ground that strikes strikes meaning for you? To what extent this year do you feel more like the seed that's cast out to land where you will? And each of those places has a different lesson for us and sheds a different light on where we are and what we need to be doing. So let's just think about the sower first. Remember that Jesus was speaking to people who were themselves sowers of seed. Part of their job, some of them, was to go through the land owner's land and sow the seeds for the plantings. Their land, they did not own the land, that they did not own the seed. Their livelihood depended on the seeds growing, but they had very little control over that. They were also people who felt that they had very little control over their own lives. Their lives were governed by chance. We identify with the farmers in particular and the sowers. The success of their sowing depended on weather, it depended on the power of the landlord, it depended on the economic ups and downs of any particular season. They themselves had very little control over any part of their lives, whether they were sowers or whether they were ordinary people. So Jesus is talking to people who don't know what it means to feel free, who don't know what it means to them. Planning means being able to get through the next day. And he's saying, just throw the seed, don't worry about where it goes. He says, if you feel constrained, just don't let yourself be boxed in. Just sow your seed. The seed will land where it may. You are responsible for spreading the seed. You're responsible for getting the word out there. You're responsible for sowing the seed. Don't worry about the condition of the ground onto which it falls. Don't worry about measuring your outcomes. Don't worry about the consequences of your failure. Don't worry about the things that you cannot control. You have a job to do. Your job is to cast the seed on the ground. And he's trying to awaken in his listeners a sense of freedom that was not ordinarily there, and which would have been confusing to them. But he's inciting in all of us, particularly now in these days, we can really identify with the sowers when we really can't even plan a month ahead, right? All of us are facing that uncertainty, that worry that we can't plan ahead. We don't know what September is going to look like. We don't even really know what August is going to look like. Sow the seed, live your life, do what you need to do, and God will take care of the rest. There are times in our lives when we hear this parable and think more about what kind of ground are we? Is our life and is our community fertile ground for the seed? And Jesus describes 4 kinds of ground, and each of those grounds we're capable of. The first kind of ground was shallow ground on the path. It fell on pathways, and it stayed on the surface of the ground, and the birds come and pick it up. We are that kind of ground, kind of what we call a well-traveled path. Our lives are that kind of ground when we don't think for ourselves, when we don't engage with our faith, when we don't open our hearts to something new, when we feel we've heard it all, done it all, we go to church out of habit. All we do is go through the motions, whether it's our prayer life or our ordinary emotional life. We feel we just let ourselves go through the motion and not be engaged. Everything washes off us, both the painful and the difficult. We are that kind of ground when we follow the rules just so that we won't get into trouble, rather than being mindful of other people. During a time of transition in particular, our lives are that kind of ground when we do everything we can to cling to predictability. When we leave ourselves or put ourselves in situations or in a position where we don't have to question, we don't have to think, we just know, we just go through the motions of all our life, intellectually, spiritually, emotionally, physically. When we are just going through the motions for whatever good reason, our lives are like a well-traveled path. It's not wasteful because the birds get the seed. The seed goes to good use, but it doesn't go to our use. The second kind of land that the seeds may fall on is the rocky ground where the seed goes just beneath, may fall, dirt may form over it, but it doesn't form roots. Our hearts and minds are like this land, when we've hardened our hearts against the possibility of anything new. When we assume that our faith will give us comfort rather than having to cost us anything. When we assume that our faith protects us from struggles and strugglers. When we assume that our faith is something that we can just hold on to. When we seek security rather than growth. When we seek to hide and stay within our own little box rather than let ourselves be drawn out, which is what happens when we form roots. Our lives are this kind of land when we deliberately and intentionally harden ourselves against any possibility. The first kind of land is where we just don't care. We don't want to think, but we haven't hardened our hearts. This is a deliberate hardening of our hearts, and we need to be mindful of when we have done that and why, and the cost of doing that. The third kind of ground is the thorny ground, where the seeds fall among thorns and the thorns choke the growth of the seeds. Our lives are that thorny ground when we're completely egocentric, when we're particularly interested only in ourselves, whether it's signaled by greed, by fear, by a spiritual hunger. We're much more aware of our own neediness than in our ability to grow. We're much more aware of our hunger for life than of the life that is within us. We're much more aware of the dreams that have not come true than we are of the dreams that we still have to grow into. We have allowed ourselves to be shaped by other people's expectations, by other people's dreams, by other people's rules and parameters and limitations. Those thorns are the thorns of our ego. and of injustice, but mostly ego. You know, our growth within us is checked because we don't have room for new life, because we have allowed other things, whether it's our own willfulness or other people's expectations, to choke out what might be um, a true spiritual vitality. And then the final kind of ground, of course, is the fertile ground. And that's what we long to be. But that fertile ground is where we are most vulnerable. It is the dark, loamy ground. It is the ground fertilized by the water of tears. It is the ground that has been deepened by wounding. It is the ground of doubt and struggle and hope. This, in this ground of vulnerability, that's where God's promise takes hold. That's where seeds grow. That is the land we can be that land, that fertile ground, only if we let down our defenses, only if we surrender our own willfulness and we downplay the expectations and disappointment and hope that other people have in us. We need to open our hearts to the possibility that we are going to become someone or a community that has not been seen on this earth before. And that means allowing God to do the planting, allowing the seed of God to enter into the most vulnerable dimension of ourselves as a community, as an individual. The fertile soil is the dark, moist soil of tears and vulnerability. And it is in that soil that true growth and beauty will grow, will happen. And then finally, we have the sower, we have the ground, and we have the seed. And there are times in our lives when we imagine ourselves or recognize ourselves most fully as the seed that God has planted. And, you know, all of us at various times in our lives find ourselves in circumstances and in places that we would not have chosen. And we look around, for better or for worse, and we look around and say, how did I land here? Well, God cast us here in the expectation and the knowledge and the providential compassion that we will grow where we have landed. So when we identify or we see ourselves as the seed of God's word, we recognize that we may not have chosen where we have landed, but the place of our landing is a place of growth. I often think at this time of year, my husband and I, you know, we spent a lot of time in Colorado, and we used to go do a lot of hiking up in the Rocky Mountains. And periodically you would just come across a tree growing out of a rock, or wildflowers growing out of a rock. You know, a bit of dirt had gotten caught in a crevice and seeds had been cast there by the wind, and beautiful growth happened. And so God's promise is that the life that he has given us will come to fruition wherever we may be, even in the most barren places of our hearts and our lives. We are the seed that God has cast on this earth so that his kingdom can grow, so that his promise of a world of abundance and peace will come about. Even the smallest of these seeds, each of us, tiny as we are, can blossom into a wild and beautiful revelation of God's promise if we prepare the soil of our hearts and if we act with the freedom and trusting abandon with which the sower acts. I want to end with a poem by Margaret Atwood. It's called The Moment. The moment when, after many years of hard work and a long voyage, you stand in the center of your room, house, half-acre, square mile, island, country, knowing at last how you got there, and you say, I own this. In that same moment, The trees unloose their soft arms from around you. The birds take back their language. The cliffs fissure and collapse. The air moves back and forth from you like waves, and you can't breathe. No, they whisper, you own nothing. You were a visitor, time after time, climbing the hill, planting the flag, proclaiming, we never belonged to you. You never found us. It was always the other way round. Sower, ground, seed. We are here through the hand of God, and we will grow into union with God by opening our hearts and our minds and our souls to all that is around us. Amen.